The parchment weighed less than a service pistol, and I had carried both. Yet when the king's private secretary set that slim leather folder in my gloved hands at 6 on a gray autumn morning, my arms felt as though they had been handed something that could crack the whole House of Harrowgate down the middle. I am Captain Idris Vane of the Household Guard, and in 22 years of standing my posts I had never once been ordered to deliver a document. Rifles, yes. Salutes, yes. A dying man's last message to his son once across a rain-soaked courtyard. But never a folder like this, sealed in the king's own crimson wax, addressed in a clerk's spare hand to Her Grace, the Queen Consort Morwenna of Harrowgate. "You understand what this is," the secretary said. It was not a question. Lord Osric had served King Alaric for 30 years, and his face that morning was the face of a man who had watched something long dreaded finally arrive. "I understand it is to be served," I said, "with dignity in person, by my own hand." "By your own hand, Captain." The king was specific, not a bailiff, not a lawyer's runner, a guardsman of the household, a man of the king's own colors, because Her Grace must see, from the moment the folder touches her palm, that this comes not from a court but from the crown itself, from him. Osric's voice did not shake, but something behind it did. "He wants it done the way a soldier lays a wreath, slowly, correctly, without a single word she can twist into a grievance." I looked down at the folder. On its cover, in the smallest possible letters, a single line had been embossed beneath the royal cipher: "Petition for the dissolution of the consort's marriage, by order of His Majesty King Alaric." Shocking, the papers would later call it. The whole realm would call it shocking. But I had stood a great many posts inside the walls of Harrowgate, and I will tell you plainly, to those of us who watched the doors and counted the silences, nothing about that morning was a surprise. It was only the sound of a very old dam, at long last, giving way. Let me tell it from the beginning, from the way I first came to understand that the Queen Consort was a storm wearing a crown. I had been posted to the Interior Corps 3 years earlier, after a knee I had wrecked in the winter drills retired me from the ceremonial line. A guardsman who can no longer stand 90 minutes without moving is no good on the forecourt where the tourists film us, but he can still stand a corridor, still watch a door, still carry the king's colors in the quiet places where the real work of a palace happens. So I traded the bearskin and the forecourt for the long inner galleries, and there, in the hush behind the public rooms, I began to see the House of Harrowgate as it truly was. King Alaric was old then, and growing older by seasons rather than years. He was a courteous man, unfailingly so, the kind of monarch who thanked the footman who poured his water and remembered the names of the gardener's children. He had ruled long and well, and if he had a flaw, it was the flaw of gentle men everywhere. He could not easily believe that a person who smiled at his table would work against him beneath it. He had loved once, truly, everyone in the household knew it, and the woman he had loved was the late Queen Isolde, dead now these 11 years, her portrait still hanging in the West Gallery where the morning light struck it just so. When Alaric passed that portrait he slowed. Sometimes he stopped. I had watched him press 2 fingers to the frame's gilded edge, as a man presses a scar to be sure it is really healed, and then walk on with his back a little straighter, as though Isolde had reminded him to stand. And then there was Morwenna. She had come to the house 6 years after Isolde died, and the marriage had been called, by the realm's kinder commentators, a comfort to a lonely king. She was younger than Alaric by a wide margin, handsome in the sharp way that photographs love, and possessed of a voice that could turn from silk to steel in the space of a syllable. She had 2 grown children of her own from before Lord Cassius, her son, all appetite and entitlement, and Lady Verena, her daughter, quieter and colder, and I came to believe the more dangerous of the 2. And from the first month of my posting to the inner galleries, I understood that the Queen Consort regarded the House of Harrowgate not as a home she had married into, but as a treasury she had been handed the keys to. It began with small things, it always does. A footman confided to me once, low, in the servants' passage, that her grace had ordered the late Queen Isolde's rooms in the east wing to be cleared and refreshed. Those rooms that King Alaric had ordered sealed and preserved the week Isolde died, and had never once unsealed in 11 years. The footman had refused. He had been dismissed within the fortnight on a pretext about missing silver that everyone knew was invented. I remembered his face. I remembered thinking, she tests the locks. A woman who tests one locked door will test them all in time, and when she finds one that opens, she will not stop opening it. There was the matter of the horse. The late Queen Isolde had kept a gray mare named Comet, a gentle old thing that Isolde had ridden the length of the North Park in the years before her illness, and which Alaric had ordered pastured and cared for at the crown's expense for as long as the animal lived. Morwenna had tried twice to have Comet transferred to Cassius's country place. "The poor beast is wasted here," she'd said, and both times an old groom named Hollies had quietly lost the transfer papers, and both times King Alaric, when he happened to hear of it, had reaffirmed his standing order in 3 cold words: "Comet stays here." I did not know then how much those 3 words cost the king to say to his own wife. I learned later. And there was the jewels, but I will come to the jewels. For a long time, years, King Alaric said nothing. He was not blind. I want that understood. A gentle man is not a stupid man, and Alaric had governed a realm through 2 wars and a plague and knew better than most how power flows and where it pools. He saw the small cruelties. He saw the way Morwenna's warmth switched off like a lamp the instant a door closed. He saw the way his own son, Crown Prince Rowan, had begun to keep his children, young Torin, young Malin, little Bram, away from certain rooms and certain suppers. He saw. But he was old and tired, and he had buried 1 wife already, and I truly think, that he could not bear the thought of the scandal, the wreckage, the ugliness of undoing a marriage in the last chapter of a long reign. So he held his silence the way we of the guard hold ours, not because nothing is wrong, but because the moment to move has not yet come. The moment came in stages. I watched it come. The first stage was the day Princess Adela returned. Adela was the king's younger sister, and if Alaric was the gentle blade of the family, Adela was the whetstone. She had spent 3 years abroad on the crown's business, trade envoy, patron of a dozen institutions, a woman who ran her own household like a well-drilled regiment and did not suffer fools, thieves, or flatterers. She came back to Harrowgate that autumn to find her brother diminished, her late sister-in-law's rooms half plundered by refreshment, and a queen consort who greeted her with a smile so thin you could have read a newspaper through it. I was on the door the day Adela and Morwenna first spoke after her return. I did not hear the words, "A good guardsman does not lean at doors," but I heard the register of the voices, and I saw the Princess Adela come out of that room with her jaw set like a portcullis. She stopped in front of me. She looked at me the way senior royals learn to look at guardsmen, which is to say she looked asterisk at asterisk me, not through me, which most of them never bother to do. "Captain Vane," she said, "how long have you stood these galleries?" 3 years this winter, your highness." "Then you have seen things." She did not phrase it as a question either. That family had a way of stating what they already knew. "You need not tell me what. I have eyes and I have just used them." She glanced back at the closed door behind her and her voice dropped. "Watch my brother, Captain. Not for his enemies at the gate, for the one at his table." She walked on, and I stood there in the gray light with those words settling into me like cold water into stone, and I understood that the silence in the House of Harrowgate had a bottom, and that we were nearing it. The second stage was the letter. I did not read it. I want that on the record. I have never in my life opened correspondence not addressed to me, and I did not open this. But I carried it unknowing, and that is its own kind of story. It was a thick envelope sealed, that a solicitor's clerk brought to the tradesman's entrance one wet evening, addressed to King Alaric, marked private and personal by hand only. The duty officer, seeing the seal of a firm the crown trusted, sent it up by a household man, and the household man on the galleries that night was me. I carried it to the king's study. Alaric was at his desk beneath a green-shaded lamp, a small old man in a large old chair, and he took the envelope from my gloved hand and looked at it for a long moment before he broke the seal. I turned to withdraw as one does, but he said quietly, "Stay a moment, Captain," and so I stayed at attention, eyes forward, while the King of Harrowgate read whatever was inside. I heard the paper. I heard his breathing change. I heard once a small sound that I have heard from men on battlefields when the wound they have been ignoring finally announces itself. Not a cry, nothing so loud, just an exhalation with the bottom knocked out of it. When I risked a glance, King Alaric had set the letter down flat on the blotter and laid both his hands upon it, palms down, as though to keep it from rising up off the desk, and he was staring at the dark window where the rain ran down. "Captain Vane," he said at last, and his voice was steady, which was worse than if it had shaken. "Do you know what the hardest thing in the world is for a man in my position?" "No, your Majesty." To be certain, he did not look at me. I have suspected for years. Suspicion is a comfortable house. A man can live in it forever, tell himself he might be wrong, tell himself that to act on a suspicion would be a cruelty. But certainty, he tapped the letter once. Certainty is a cold country, Captain, and it has no roads back. I said nothing. There was nothing to say, and he had not asked me anything. "You may go," he said, and then as I reached the door, "Say nothing of this, not that you carried it, not that you saw my face." "I have already forgotten both, your Majesty," I said, which was the closest a guardsman comes to a vow, and I meant it, and I have kept it, until now, when the keeping no longer serves him and the telling honors him. He is beyond the reach of either now, but the truth of that gray year deserves a witness, and I am the one who was there. What was in the letter I would learn only much later and only in part. It concerned the jewels, the late Queen Isolde's jewels, a collection of no small value that Isolde had left, in a will as clear as spring water, not to the crown and not to any consort who might come after, but to her granddaughter Princess Malin, to be held in trust until the girl came of age. That will had been filed, witnessed, sealed. And the letter that reached King Alaric that wet night was from an honest solicitor who had discovered that certain of those jewels, a diamond collar, a pair of emerald drops, a ring that Isolde had worn to her own coronation, had quietly over the preceding 2 years been appraised, insured under a new name, and in one case sold, and that the paper trail, however carefully laundered, led back through Lady Morwenna's accounts to a single directing hand. Morwenna's. A woman who tests the locks, a woman who, finding one door open, does not stop. King Alaric was old and gentle and slow to move. But he was also a king, and Isolde had been his queen, and the granddaughter whose birthright had been quietly bled away was a small girl of 9 who called him grandfather, and did not yet know that anyone had ever wished her harm. And there are wrongs a gentle man will swallow for the sake of peace, and there is a line past which even the gentlest man discovers he has an iron in him he had forgotten he owned. The letter was the certainty, and certainty, as the king had said, is a country with no roads back. I did not know, that wet night, that within a season I would be the hand that carried the king across that border. I only knew that the House of Harrowgate had gone very quiet in a new way, the quiet not of a thing sleeping but of a thing being decided, and that in the mornings, when I passed the West Gallery on my rounds, the king had begun to stop at the late Queen Isolde's portrait not for a moment but for minutes, standing before that painted face in the pale light, saying nothing, his old hands folded, like a man reporting to his commanding officer that the order she had left him would, at last, be carried out. The decision, when it came, did not come as thunder, it came as procedure. That is a thing people who have never lived inside a great house do not understand. They imagine that a king who resolves to unmake a marriage does it in a single towering scene, a door flung open, a shouted accusation, a slap of paper on a table. But a crown does not work that way, and Alaric least of all. A crown moves the way a glacier moves, slowly, silently, and with a force that shears the mountain when at last it arrives. For 6 weeks after the wet night of the letter, the king said nothing to anyone that I could see. He took his meals. He received his ministers. He smiled at Morwenna across the long table, and she smiled back, and neither of them, I think, was fooled, but neither of them broke the surface. And beneath that surface the machinery turned. I learned the shape of it only in fragments, the way a guardsman always learns things: a folder glimpsed, a name overheard, a solicitor shown up the private stair after dark and shown down again before the household woke. Lord Osric, the private secretary, grew thinner and quieter. Princess Adela came and went with a leather case she never let out of her own hand. Twice, a man I did not know, gray-suited, gray-faced, plainly a lawyer of the most senior and discreet kind, was received in the king's study for hours, and each time he left, the king stood a while at the West Gallery portrait before he would let the day resume. And once, only once, I heard the king and his sister speak of it plainly, and I heard it because they meant me to. It was late, I had the galleries. The king's study door stood a hand's breadth open, which it never did, and I understood that the open door was permission that Alaric, who forgot nothing, knew a guardsman stood the corridor and had chosen to let the guardsman hear. Inside, Adela's voice, low and hard as a farrier's file. You are certain of the will, of the trust, of the child's name on it? Isolde was certain, the king answered. She wrote it in her own hand while she still had a steady one. The jewels are Malin's. They were never Morwenna's to touch, never mine to give, never the crown's to sell, and they have been touched, given, and sold. A pause. I have the appraisals. I have the insurance filed under a false name. I have the account. I have, Adela, the asterisk certainty. Then why do you hesitate? The silence that followed was long enough that I thought the conversation had ended. Then the king said, in a voice I had not heard him use before, not a king's voice at all, but an old man's. Because when I do this, it will be said that Alaric in his dotage cast out his wife. It will be in every paper. It will be the last thing my reign is remembered for, not the wars I ended, not the plague I saw the realm through, not Isolde, this. And I find, sister, that I am vain enough to grieve that. You are not casting out a wife, Adela said. You are recovering a child's inheritance from a thief who happens to wear your ring. There is a difference, Alaric, and if you cannot see it, look at your granddaughter and you will. Another silence, and then the king's voice, changed, steadier, colder, resolved, the voice of a man who has finished grieving a thing and moved to the far side of it. It will be done correctly, every step. She will be given every courtesy the law and her dignity allow. She will not be able to say she was ambushed or humiliated or denied. The papers will be drawn by the best hands in the realm, and they will be unbreakable, and they will be served. And here he paused, and I have wondered ever since whether he knew I was listening when he said it. They will be served by my own colors, by a man of the household. So that from the first instant she understands this is not a lawyer's quarrel she can drag through years of courts. It is the crown. It is done. I stood the rest of that watch with those words in me, and I did not yet know that the man of the household he spoke of would be me. But I think, standing there, some part of me already knew, the way you know before a battle that you will be in the first rank of it, not by any evidence, but by the simple weight of being the one who happened to be standing in the right corridor when the king made up his mind. The weeks that followed were the strangest of my service, because on the surface nothing changed and beneath it everything did. Morwenna, I believe, sensed something. A predator senses the tide. Her behavior in that season grew, if anything, more lavish and more grasping at once, as though some instinct told her the season of grasping was drawing to a close, and she meant to fill her arms before the door shut. She held a great reception for a purpose no one could name and wore to it, a necklace that Princess Adela recognized at once. I saw the princess go still across the room, a sapphire piece that had belonged not to Isolde but to the king and Adela's own late mother, the old queen, and that had been catalogued, everyone assumed, in the sealed royal collection. Morwenna wore it at her own throat and dared the room to say a word. No one did. That is how these things work. The theft is committed in the open, in plain sight, wrapped in a smile, precisely because to name it would be a scandal and the powerful count on your reluctance to make one. But the king saw, and the king now was counting. Cassius, Morwenna's son, chose that same season to overreach in his own coarser way. He arrived at Harrowgate with a valuation firm in tow, to assess the family assets for insurance purposes, he said, and I had the profound displeasure of standing the door of the long gallery while Cassius strolled its length with an appraiser at his elbow, pointing at this painting, and that cabinet the way a man points at dishes on a market stall. He stopped before the late Queen Isolde's portrait, the king's portrait, the one Alaric slowed for, and he studied it, and he said to the appraiser, loud enough for me to hear, "This one's a name, I think. Worth a bit. We'll want that one looked at." And he moved on. I did not move. I did not speak. It is not a guardsman's place. But I marked him. I marked the day and the hour and the word wheel, which told me that in his own mind Cassius already owned the house of Harrowgate down to its nails. And I thought of the king standing before that same portrait pressing 2 fingers to its frame, and I thought, you have no idea, boy, what is already in motion beneath your feet. The midpoint of that long gray year, the moment the game itself changed, came with the children. Crown Prince Rowan had 3, Torrin, 11, grave and watchful for his age, Malin, 9, the granddaughter to whom the jewels belonged, though she knew nothing of it, and little Bram, 6, who at that age loves everyone and suspects no one. Rowan had for months been quietly keeping them clear of Morwenna's wing of the house, and Morwenna had for months been quietly resenting it, because a queen consort who cannot command the children of the air has a crack in her authority that the whole household can see through. Matters came to a head over a small thing, as they always do. Malin had left a favorite drawing, a child's careful watercolor of the gray mare comet, pinned in the nursery corridor. Morwenna, passing, took it down. Whether she meant anything by it or merely disliked clutter, I cannot say and will not guess. But Malin came looking for her drawing and did not find it, and was told by a nurse that her grace had removed it. And the small girl, this is the part I witnessed, for I had the nursery gallery that afternoon, walked the length of the corridor to the door of Morwenna's rooms, and stood before it, and asked, in the clear, unafraid voice of a child who has not yet learned to be afraid of the powerful, to have her picture back. I do not know precisely what was said behind that door, for it closed. But I heard the register of Morwenna's voice go from silk to steel, and I heard the child's voice grow smaller, and when the door opened again, Malin came out without her drawing and with her chin trembling and her small hands in fists at her sides, and she did not cry. She was Isolde's granddaughter, and she did not cry, but she walked past me with her eyes bright and furious, and something in me, some old thing under the discipline, turned over and would not turn back. That was the day I stopped being merely a witness to the House of Harrowgate's slow war. I had held my post for 3 years and told myself it was not my quarrel, that a guardsman keeps his silence and his station, and lets the great sort out the great. But a small girl had asked, politely, for a picture of a horse, and been sent away with empty hands by a woman I knew to be a thief. And I understood, watching Malin's furious little back recede down the gallery, that there are silences a man keeps because they are his duty and silences he keeps because he is a coward, and that the two can wear the same uniform, and that a man had better learn the difference before the day comes when he is asked to act. The day came sooner than I thought. It was 3 weeks later, on a Thursday, that Lord Osric found me at the end of my morning watch and asked me to attend the king, not to stand a post, to attend, to be received. In 22 years a king had received me, as a man rather than as furniture, perhaps 4 times, and each time it had changed my life. I straightened my tunic, I checked my gloves, and I went up the private stair with my heart going harder than any drill had ever made it go. King Alaric received me in the small study, not the great one, the room where he did his true work, lined with books and hung with a single painting, a study of Isolde as a young woman before the crown, laughing at something out of frame. He was standing when I came in, which surprised me. The king's knees were as bad as mine by then, and he sat when he could. But he stood to receive me, and he did not sit down for the whole of what followed, and I understood that he stood because what he was about to ask of me was the kind of thing a man asks standing. "Captain Vane," he said, "you carried a letter to me in the autumn on a wet night." "I remember no such thing, your majesty," I said, because I had promised him I had forgotten, and I keep my promises. Something almost like a smile crossed the old king's face. "You are a good man, Captain, and a better one than you let yourself be told. But I release you from that forgetting, for one morning only, because I must speak of it, and I must speak of it to the man who is going to finish what that letter began." I said nothing. My mouth had gone dry as parade ground dust. "You know then in general terms what has been prepared." He gestured to his desk where a slim leather folder lay, closed, sealed in crimson. "The petition is drawn. It is complete, it is correct, and it is, my lawyers assure me, without a flaw a court could catch a fingernail on. It sets out the grounds, the trust, the will, the jewels, the sales, the false insurance, all of it, documented past any denial. It seeks the dissolution of the consort's marriage and the restoration to the crown, and to the trust of my granddaughter, of every property and every stone that was taken. It is, Captain, the most careful document I have caused to be made in 50 years of reigning, because it concerns the least careful person I have ever had the misfortune to marry." He picked the folder up. He held it a moment in his two old hands, the way a man holds a thing he has decided about but not made peace with. "Now it must be served, handed to her, in person formally, so that the law's clock begins and there can be no claim she did not know. Any bailiff could do it, any clerk, but I will not have it done by a bailiff or a clerk." His pale eyes came up to mine and held them, and there was iron in them, the iron Adela had said her brother still owned somewhere under the gentleness. "I will have it done by a guardsman of my own household, in the king's colors with the king's discipline, so that from the instant the folder touches her hand she understands three things: that this is not a lawyer's squabble, that it comes from the crown itself, and that it will be carried out with such perfect correctness, such flawless dignity, that she will never, not in any paper, not before any court, not to any friend, be able to say she was ambushed, insulted, or handled with anything but honor." He set the folder down and pushed it an inch toward me across the desk. "You will not gloat, you will not lecture, you will not so much as let a muscle in your face move. You will hand her this folder as you would lay a wreath upon a casket, slowly, correctly, with reverence for the gravity of the moment, and you will say the words the law requires and not one word more, because the strength of what I do, Captain, is not in my anger, it is in my asterisk correctness. A man who is right and calm cannot be beaten, a man who is right and cruel can. Do you understand me?" "I understand, your majesty," I said, and I did. God help me, I understood him to the bone. He was not asking me to punish Morwenna. He was asking me to remove punishment from the equation entirely, to make the act so clean, so dignified, so unassailably correct, that its whole terrible force fell on her not as a blow, but as a truth. There is nothing a person like Morwenna fears more than to be handled with dignity, because cruelty she can weaponize and dignity she cannot. "Will you do it?" the king asked. A guardsman does not refuse the king. But Alaric had phrased it as a question, and I understood why, because he was asking me to do a thing that would follow me, that men would talk of, that would put me forever in the frame of the day a wife was cast down, and he was too honorable to order that onto a man's record without giving the man the dignity of a real yes. So I gave him a real one. "I will do it, your majesty, with every ounce of honor in me." "I know you will," he said. "That is why it is you. And then, quietly, as I took the folder up and felt its terrible light weight settle into my gloved hands, "Thank you, Captain Vane. You are carrying something I could not carry myself, not because I lack the courage. Because a king who serves his own wife with divorce papers by his own hand looks like a man taking revenge. A king who sends his most disciplined guardsman to do it with dignity looks like what it is: justice." He turned to the young, laughing portrait of Isolde on the wall. She would have known how to do this without a moment's hesitation. She was iron where I am only cold. But she left it to me, and I have left it to you, and between the three of us I think it will be done as she would have wished. I did not serve the papers that morning. That is the part people misunderstand when I tell it. A thing of such weight is not flung the instant it is decided. It is prepared, staged, timed, so that when it happens correctly and once. The king's lawyers required that certain filings be lodged first with the court, that certain witnesses be present, that the moment of service be recorded so that its very correctness could never afterward be disputed. Princess Adela was to be present, as the senior royal of the king's own blood, so that no one could later claim the household had acted alone or in shadow. And the timing was chosen with a care I only came to appreciate later. It was to be done not in some private cornering that could be called an ambush, but in the open, in a receiving room, in the daylight, before witnesses, in the way a lawful and dignified act should be done. So I carried the folder back to the guard's strong room, and I locked it away. And for 6 days I stood my posts and told no one, and the folder waited. And the House of Harrowgate went about its business not knowing that the dam had already cracked, and that the water was merely choosing its hour. In those 6 days, the escalations came thick, as though the house itself sensed the pressure building, and the actors in it played their parts to the last. Cassius returned with a lawyer of his own, a smooth, expensive man, and I heard from the duty officer that Cassius had begun making inquiries about the king's testamentary intentions, which is the polite phrase a grasping heir uses when he means how much of this will be mine when the old man dies. He had gone so far as to have the smooth lawyer approach Lord Alaric about regularizing the ownership of certain rooms and certain artworks, while His Majesty is still able to sign. The audacity of it turned my stomach. Here was the king preparing, with anguish and care, to right an old wrong, and here was the thief's son, in the same days, trying to steal the deed to the house out from under the man's failing hand. Morwenna, for her part, made her boldest move yet. She summoned the household controller, the officer who keeps the accounts of the king's private estate, and instructed him to transfer the management of a set of properties, including the late Queen Isolde's sealed east wing rooms and the pasture where the gray mare Comet grazed, into a trust controlled by Lady Verena. She had drawn up the papers herself, or had them drawn, and she required only the controller's countersignature to set the machinery in motion. It was, I understood when I heard of it, a race, Morwenna trying to lock away the very assets that the king's petition was about to reclaim before the petition could be served. She meant to have title to it all sewn up so tight that even the crown's lawyers would need years to unpick it. The controller, an honest, frightened man named Bellamy, did not know what to do. He came to Lord Alaric in a sweat, and Alaric came to the king, and the king, I am told, sat very still for a long moment and then said only, "Delay it. Lose the ink. Find a reason the signature cannot be given today. Buy me 3 days, Bellamy, and I will make it so you never regret it." And Bellamy, God bless the small brave men of this world, went back and told the Queen Consort that the transfer could not be completed until certain records were retrieved from the archive, which would take, he was terribly sorry, several days. Morwenna's fury at the delay, I heard, was a thing to behold. But she could not know that the delay was the sound of her own trap closing, and that every hour Bellamy stole from her was an hour the king's petition drew nearer to her door. On the 5th day, Princess Adela sought me out. She found me in the armory passage off duty, and she did not waste words. "Captain, you have the folder." "I have it, Your Highness." Good, she studied me with those level farrier's file eyes. Do you understand what my brother has asked of you? Not the mechanics, the heart of it. He has asked me to serve the papers with dignity, your highness, so that the act's whole force is in its correctness. Something in her face eased, very slightly. Then you understand it better than half the court would. Listen to me, Captain Vane. She stepped closer, and her voice dropped to the register of one soldier confiding in another. That woman has spent 6 years learning to weaponize every scene she is in. If you shout, she will weep and call you a brute, and there will be sympathy for her by nightfall. If you sneer, she will point at your sneer and cry persecution. If you rush her, she will call it an ambush. She has one weapon, Captain, and it is other people's loss of composure. Do you see? Your dignity is not merely good manners. It is the whole of the battle. The instant you keep perfect discipline while handing her the ruin of everything she schemed for, she has nothing to grip. No cruelty to answer. No rage to mirror. Just the quiet, correct, unanswerable truth in your gloved hands. She stepped back. My brother chose the right man. Do not prove me wrong. I do not intend to, your highness. No, she said. I don't believe you do. And she left me there in the armory passage, and I stood a long while afterward turning her words over because she had named the thing exactly. The battle was not in the papers. The battle was in my composure. I had stood 90-minute posts without moving a muscle while tourists shouted in my face and children waved, and once a drunk swung a bottle at my head. I had thought that discipline a small, ornamental thing, a matter of not scratching an itch. Now I understood it had been training, all of it. For a single morning when a woman would try with every art she possessed to make me lose it, and everything would turn on whether I could stand as still inside as I had learned to stand without. On the 6th night I did not sleep. I cleaned my gloves though they were clean. I checked the seal on the folder though no one had touched it, and in the small dark hours I found myself thinking not of Morwenna at all, but of a small girl walking away from a closed door with empty hands and her chin held high, and of an old king standing before a laughing portrait. And I found that the weight I had felt when the folder first touched my hands had changed its nature entirely. It was not a burden any longer, it was an honor. It was the finest and gravest duty a guardsman of the House of Harrowgate had ever been handed, and I meant to be worthy of it or die trying. Morning came gray again. The House of Harrowgate does its great business in gray light, it seems, and Lord Alaric came for me at 6:30 and said only, "It is today, Captain, at 10. The receiving room, Her Grace has been asked to attend on a matter of estate business. She does not know what it is." He paused. "The Princess Adela will be present. The court's officer will record it. His Majesty," and here Alaric's voice thickened, "His Majesty will not be in the room. He asked me to tell you why. He said, tell the captain I would face her if it were only my quarrel. But it is not my quarrel. It is the law's, and the law wears his colors today, not mine. Let it be the crown she faces, and not an old man's hurt." I took the folder from the strong room. I checked its seal one last time. And at 3 minutes to 10, with Princess Adela at my side and the court's gray officer behind me, and the whole vast quiet House of Harrowgate seeming to hold its breath around us, I walked toward the receiving room to serve the Queen Consort with the ruin of everything she had schemed to steal, slowly, correctly, and with more dignity than she had shown any soul in that house in 6 long years. The receiving room of Harrowgate is a long, high chamber with tall windows down one side and a fireplace at the far end, and it was in that gray 10 o'clock light that I first saw the Queen Consort as I would see her for the rest of my life, whenever the memory surfaced. Standing near the windows in a gown the color of old wine, one hand resting on the back of a chair, her chin tilted, her whole bearing pitched to the register of a woman who has been summoned about estate business, and intends to conduct that business briskly and get on with her day. She was, I will grant her this, magnificent to look at. Whatever rot was in her, it had not touched the surface. And at her throat, that morning, she wore the sapphire necklace, the old queen's necklace, the one from the sealed royal collection, as though to remind whatever bureaucrat she expected exactly who she was. Beside her, a little behind, stood Lady Verena, her daughter, pale and watchful, holding a leather portfolio of her own. And near the door, arriving just as we did, came Lord Cassius, summoned too, I think, or perhaps merely drawn by the scent of estate business, the way a shark is drawn by blood in water. He looked at me, and at the folder in my gloved hands, and something crossed his face, not yet fear, but the first cousin of it, the puzzlement of a man who cannot place why a guardsman would be carrying a document. Princess Adela entered ahead of me and took a position by the fireplace, hands folded, saying nothing, her presence alone lending the room the weight of the crown. The court's gray officer took a chair to the side and opened a small book to record, and I walked to the center of the room, halted, and came to attention with the folder held level before me in both gloved hands. Morwenna's eyes went to the folder, then to me, then to Adela by the fire, and I watched the calculation begin behind her face, the swift, cold reckoning of a woman who has survived by reading rooms and had just realized she could not read this one. "What is this?" she said, silk still, but I heard the first thread of steel underneath. I did not answer at once. It was not my place to open the matter. The law has its order, and I would keep it. I looked instead to Princess Adela, who inclined her head the smallest fraction, the signal that I might proceed. "Your Grace," I said, and I kept my voice as level and quiet as the morning drill, no more force in it than a man uses to report the weather. "I am Captain Idris Vane of the Household Guard. I am here upon the direct order of His Majesty King Alaric to place into your hands a petition drawn in his name." I took one step forward, slowly, correctly, the way one approaches a casket. "It is a petition for the dissolution of your marriage, and for the restoration to the crown and to the lawful trust of certain property. I am to serve it upon you formally, so that the law's notice is given. That is the whole of my office here." For a moment, a single-held moment, the room did not breathe. Then Morwenna laughed. It was not a large laugh, and it was not at first an ugly one. It was a light, disbelieving, dismissive laugh, the laugh of a woman who has decided the only sane response to an absurdity is to refuse to take it seriously. "Divorce papers," she said. "You have come to serve me, the Queen Consort of this realm, in my own house with divorce papers, carried by a ** guard." She said the word the way one says gutter. "Alaric hasn't the spine to do it himself, so he sends a footman with a gun. How perfectly like him." She stepped away from the chair, toward me, and the silk was burning off her voice now, the steel showing through. "Take that back to wherever it was drawn up. I do not accept it. I will not touch it. There is no marriage to dissolve, Captain, because I am the queen of this house, and I will be the queen of it when your king is in the ground and you are pensioned off with your bad knee to some barracks. Do you hear me? I refuse it. Here I want to be exact, because this was the false floor beneath the whole morning, the moment where a lesser plan would have collapsed. She had done the shrewdest thing available to her. She had refused to take the folder. A document unhanded is, some would argue, a document unserved, and a woman who will not accept papers cannot be bound by them, and if I lost my composure, if I reached out and forced the folder upon her, or raised my voice, or so much as let irritation cross my face, she would have exactly what Adela had warned me of. A scene, a brute, a guardsman manhandling the queen. By nightfall, the story would not be the king reclaimed a child's stolen inheritance. It would be * the king's thug assaulted a defenseless woman *, and every ounce of the correctness the king had built over 6 anguished weeks would drain out through that one crack. So I did not move to force it. I did not raise my voice. I did not let one muscle in my face shift from its parade calm. I simply held the folder level, exactly where it was, and I let the silence do the work, and when I spoke it was in the same quiet register as before, not 1 degree warmer or colder. "Your Grace," I said, "the law does not require that you accept the folder. It requires only that it be tendered to you in your presence before witnesses with its nature plainly stated. That has now been done, whether you take it into your hand or leave it upon this table. And here I stepped slowly to the long table by the windows and laid the folder down upon it, squared to the edges, precise as a wreath upon a casket. The notice is given, and the law's clock has begun. I place it here, before Her Highness the Princess Adela and before the officer of the court, so that the record shows it was offered to you with every courtesy and refused. That is all the correctness requires. And His Majesty, I added, and this was the only thing I said that morning that was not strictly the language of the law, but I judged it fair, and I said it gently. His Majesty instructed me particularly that you be shown every courtesy. I hope you will believe I have tried. The refusal, you see, was her trap for me. And I had stepped around it not by force but by stepping back, by being so exactly correct that her refusal changed nothing, harmed no one but herself, and left her standing in a room where the papers now lay squared upon a table, and the clock now ran, and there was not a single ungracious act on the record for her to point to. She had reached for her one weapon, other people's loss of composure, and closed her hand on air. I saw the moment she understood it. I have seen men understand in battle that a position they thought secure had been outflanked while they were looking the wrong way, and it is a particular thing to watch happen to a face. Morwenna's went, in the space of 3 seconds, from contempt to confusion to something white and still. She looked at the squared folder on the table. She looked at Princess Adela by the fire, who had not moved and would not, whose silence was a wall. She looked at the gray officer's pen, moving. And then, because a cornered predator does not surrender but lashes, she changed her tactics entirely. On what grounds, she said, and now the silk was gone completely and only the steel remained. You stand there talking of correctness. What asterisk grounds does an old fool invent to unmake his own marriage? Say it. Say it in front of your princess and your little clerk. What has Morwenna done? And this was the second trap, subtler than the first. She was inviting me to accuse her, to stand there and read out the charges, the jewels, the thefts, the sales, the false insurance, because if I did, I would become the accuser, and the accuser can be answered, denied, dragged into argument, made to look like a persecutor. A guardsman reciting a woman's alleged crimes in her own receiving room is a scene she could work with, but the law did not require me to argue the grounds. The grounds were in the folder. My office was only to serve. Your Grace, I said, the grounds are set out in full within the petition, drawn by His Majesty's lawyers and documented past dispute. It is not my office to argue them, and I will not. If you take up the folder and read it now, or in an hour, or with counsel of your own, you will find every ground stated, every document cited. I am a guardsman, not a lawyer, and it would be improper of me to say one word beyond what the law asks of me. I have served the papers. The answer belongs to the court, and to your own counsel, and not to me. I watched her hunt in the seconds after that for the third trap, and I watched her fail to find one. And I watched. This is the part I will remember when I am as old as the king is now. I watched the Queen Consort of Harrowgate come, at last and against her whole will, up against a thing she could not scheme her way through. A man doing his duty correctly, who could not be shouted into cruelty, nor argued into accusation, nor forced into a scene, and who had laid the ruin of all her plans upon a table with the reverence one shows a coffin, and stepped back, and would not be moved. It was Cassius who broke. He had been standing near the door through all of this, and I had all but forgotten him, and now he crossed the room in 3 fast strides toward the table where the folder lay. This is absurd, he said loud, his composure gone where his mother's held. You can't do this. My mother is the queen. These, he snatched the folder up off the table, and I did not stop him, for it was already served and the record already made. These are worthless. I'll have every lawyer in the realm. Put it down, Cassius. Princess Adela spoke for the first time, and her voice went through the room like a blade through cloth. She did not raise it. She did not need to. You are holding a petition of the crown, drawn by the king, served by his guard, recorded by an officer of the court. Tear it if you like. There are copies enough to paper the east wing, but understand what you are holding before you play the fool with it, because that document does not only end your mother's marriage. She let a small, terrible silence fall. It also names the jewels, and the false insurance, and the accounts, yours among them, I believe. I watched the color leave Cassius's face the way water leaves a cracked jug. He set the folder down on the table, carefully now, very carefully, and stepped back from it as though it had grown warm in his hands. "That's not," he began. "Sit down," said Adela, "and be quiet, and let your mother decide whether she wishes to make this worse, because you can, you know." She turned her level gaze upon Morwenna. "You can fight it in every court for years and lose in every one, and spend everything you have not already stolen on lawyers who will tell you privately that you cannot win. Or you can be, for once in your tenure in this house, dignified. My brother has given you that door, Morwenna. He served these papers with a guardsman, and not a mob of pressmen, precisely so that you might, if you chose, walk out of this with what little grace you have left. He did that for you. It is more mercy than you showed a 9-year-old girl over a picture of a horse." And her voice, at the last, went cold as the gray light in the windows. "The choice of how this ends is, remarkably, still partly yours. Choose well." The room went very still. I have stood in a great many silences in my service. The silence of the forecourt at dawn before the crowds come, the silence of a chapel at a state funeral, the silence of a corridor at 3 in the morning, when a king reads a letter that ends his marriage. But I do not think I have ever stood in a silence quite like the one that filled the receiving room of Harrowgate in the seconds after Princess Adela finished speaking. It was the silence of a scheme collapsing. You could almost hear it, if a thing like that could make a sound, the quiet, structural groan of 6 years of grasping coming apart from the inside. Morwenna did not weep, I will give her that. Whatever else she was not a woman who wept when weeping would not serve her, and she understood, I think, that in a room containing Princess Adela and a court officer's pen, weeping would not serve her. She stood by the tall windows with the gray light on her wine-colored gown and the old queen's sapphires at her throat, and she looked at the squared folder on the table, and I watched her run, one last time, through every card she had and find that every one of them was a card she had already lost. Then she reached up slowly and unclasped the sapphire necklace from her throat. I did not know in that moment what she meant to do. Neither, I think, did Adela. I saw the princess's shoulders shift, the smallest readiness. But Morwenna simply held the necklace a moment in her 2 hands, the great blue stones catching what light the gray windows gave them. And then she laid it upon the table beside the folder precisely, with a care that mirrored, mockingly, or perhaps for the first time in her life sincerely. I could not tell the care with which I had laid the papers down. "There," she said, "you want the old woman's necklace, take it. It was always going to come to this, wasn't it, an accounting of stones. That is what this house is, not a family. A vault with people living in it." She looked at Adela, and for one moment the mask slipped entirely and something almost human showed through. Bitterness, yes, but under the bitterness, exhaustion, the exhaustion of a person who has spent 6 years fighting a war she was always going to lose and has just now, in a gray receiving room, run out of the strength to pretend otherwise. You think me a monster. Perhaps I am. But I married a man who was still in love with a portrait, in a house that measured me every morning against a dead woman and found me wanting, and I decided, very well, if I am to be the intruder in the vault, I will at least come away with something for it. That was my crime. I refused to be poor in a house full of treasure that everyone agreed was not for me. Isolde's jewels were not for you, Adela said, and there was no give in her at all. They were for a child, her granddaughter, 9 years old. You did not take from a house full of treasure, Morwenna. You took from a little girl who owns a watercolor of a horse and not much else that you had not already tried to take. Do not dress it as poverty. You wore the old queen's sapphires to breakfast. Morwenna had no answer to that. There is no answer to that. And I saw the last of the fight go out of her. Not into grace, exactly. Adela's word had been too generous. But into a kind of cold, spent stillness. The stillness of a gambler who has pushed in the last of the pile and watched the wrong card turn. "What happens now?" she said. It was not quite a question. It was the sound of a woman asking to be told the shape of her defeat so that she might at least meet it standing. And it was here that the king's whole strategy revealed its final wisdom. Because there was no cruelty left in the room to feed on, no scene, no accuser, no brute, nothing for her to weaponize, and so the only thing that could happen now was the plain unfolding of consequence, correct and quiet and unanswerable. "Now," said Adela, "you will be given rooms, comfortable rooms in the North Pavilion apart from the family, while the petition proceeds, which it will, and which you will lose because it is true and it is documented, and there is no court in the realm that will find otherwise. You will have counsel of your own, at your own expense. My brother will not deny you that. The jewels that were Isolde's and the stones from the royal collection will be recovered and restored to the trust and to the crown. Every one, Morwenna, they are all catalogued, and the appraisers you used kept better records than you hoped. The properties you tried to transfer to Verona this very week." And here I saw Verona flinch at the door, understanding for the first time that her own hand was in the record too, "will remain the crown's. The controller has not signed, and he will not. And you will leave this house when the court has done with what the law allows you, and not one stone more. That is what happens now." She paused. "It is a great deal gentler than what you planned for a 9-year-old, and a great deal gentler than you deserve. You may thank my brother's decency for that, since you never valued it while you had it." Cassius from his chair made one last sound, a lawyer's noise, a bluster about contesting and appealing and the years it would take. Adela did not even turn her head. "Contest it," she said. "By all means. Every year you drag it out is a year the papers report the jewels and the insurance and the accounts yours among them, Cassius. You are welcome to make your own ruin louder, but you will lose, and you will lose publicly, and you will lose expensively, and at the end of it you will still leave this house with empty hands. Or," she let the word hang, "or you can go quietly and let it be said that when the reckoning came, the Queen Consort's family at least knew how to lose with dignity. It is the last thing this house can offer you. I would take it if I were you. But I am not you, thank God." And that quiet, correct, unanswerable dismantling was the turn the whole long gray year had been building toward. Not a shout, not a slap of paper, not a guardsman's fist, a folder laid squared upon a table with the reverence of a wreath, a necklace unclasped in defeat, and a truth so complete and so calmly stated that there was simply nothing left in the room to fight it with. The king had been right. The strength was not in the anger. It was in the correctness. A person who is right and calm cannot be beaten, and I had watched it proven, that gray morning, in the receiving room of Harrowgate, with my own gloved hands upon the instrument of it. I served the papers. That was my whole office, and I had done it. But I have come to understand in the years since that what I truly did that morning was something a little larger than deliver a document. I held a line. Not a rifle line on a forecourt, but a line inside myself, the line between duty and cruelty, between correctness and revenge, and I held it under the most artful assault. A scheming woman could mount against it, and because I held it, an old king's justice landed as justice and not as vengeance, and a small girl's inheritance came home. Morwenna left the receiving room a few minutes later, escorted with perfect courtesy at a respectful distance by 2 of my own men whom I had chosen for their steadiness to the North Pavilion. She did not look at me as she passed, but at the door she paused and half turned and said to no one and to the room in a voice from which all the silk and most of the steel had drained. He never once raised his voice to me, in 6 years, not once. I used to think it was weakness. She did not finish the thought. She did not need to. She went out into the gray light of the gallery, and the door closed, and it was over. I gathered up the folder, the served copy, for the record and the sapphire necklace, which I would deliver to Lord Osric to be restored to the collection, and I stood a moment in the emptying room. Princess Adela came to me before she left. She looked at me the way she had looked at me in the armory passage, level and appraising, and then she did a thing that senior royals do not often do to guardsmen. She offered me her hand. "You held it," she said as I took it, "the whole morning. You did not give her 1 inch of ground to stand on. Do you know how rare that is, Captain? To be tested by a person who knows every art of provocation, and to give her nothing. My brother chose the right man. I told him he had, and I do not like being wrong, so thank you for sparing me." "It was the king's design, your highness," I said. "I only carried it." "No," she said. "A design is only paper until a man is found who can carry it without dropping it or breaking it or turning it into something ugly in his hands. You were the man. Do not let anyone, least of all yourself, tell you it was only carrying." She released my hand. "Now go and tell my brother it is done. He has been sitting in the small study since dawn, waiting, and he will not rest until he hears it from the man who did it." So I went up the private stair one more time, with the served folder under my arm and the old Queen sapphires in my breast pocket, to report to the king that the thing he could not carry himself had been carried, correctly, to its end. King Alaric was where his sister had said he would be, in the small study, in the large old chair, beneath the study of young Isolde laughing at something out of frame. He had not, I think, moved much since dawn. There was a cup of tea gone cold at his elbow and a book open on his knee that he had plainly not read a word of. When I came in, he did not ask me anything. He only looked at me, and I understood that after 6 weeks of anguish and a lifetime of gentleness, the old man could not quite bring himself to form the question, and so I answered it before he had to. "It is done, your majesty. The petition was served. Every courtesy was shown. Her grace refused to take the folder into her hand, so I laid it before her, squared upon the table in the presence of Her Highness the Princess Adela and the officer of the court, and stated its nature plainly, and the notice is given and the law's clock has begun. There was no scene. There was no cruelty. There is nothing on the record that anyone could ever call anything but correct." I paused, and then, because he deserved to know the whole of it, I added, "She surrendered the necklace herself, your majesty, the old Queen's sapphires. She unclasped it and laid it on the table beside the papers. I have it here." I drew it from my breast pocket and set it gently upon his desk. The king looked at the necklace for a long moment. Then he looked up at the portrait of his mother's generation, and then at the laughing young Isolde on the wall, and I saw his old eyes shine. Though no tear fell, he was a king, and he did not weep in front of a guardsman, but I saw the shine, and I looked away to spare him, as one does. "Correctly," he said at last, very quietly. "It was done correctly. And with dignity. With every ounce of it in me, your majesty." "I know," he said. "I have already heard from my sister, who does not praise a man twice in a decade, that you gave that woman not 1 inch to stand on," she said. And something almost like a smile touched the old king's mouth. She said I had, for once, chosen the right man, and that it pained her to admit I had chosen well, and would I please not make a habit of it. "That is high honor, Captain, from Adela. You should keep it." "I shall, your majesty." He was quiet a while. Then he rose slowly, on his bad knees, waving off my instinctive move to help him, and he crossed to the tall window and stood looking out over the gray park, and he spoke to me with his back turned, which I understood was so that I should not have to see his face. "Do you know what I feared, Captain? Through all these weeks, I did not fear the scandal in the end. A man my age has weathered scandals. I feared that in doing this I would become, in the doing of it, the very thing I was acting against. That to cast down a schemer I would have to scheme, to answer cruelty I would have to be cruel, to reclaim a child's inheritance I would have to descend to the level of the person who stole it. I feared that justice, when it finally came, would look no different from revenge, and that would have poisoned the whole of it and poisoned me. That is why I would not do it myself, and that is why I asked it of you and asked it be done with dignity above all things, because a guardsman of the household doing his duty correctly could keep the act clean in a way an angry old husband never could. He turned from the window. You kept it clean. You let it be justice and not vengeance. And in doing that you have given me back not only Isolde's jewels and Malin's birthright, but something I feared I would lose in the reclaiming, my own good conscience. That is not a small gift, Captain Vane. I do not know how a king repays it. You have already repaid it, Your Majesty, I said, by trusting me to carry it. He looked at me a long moment, and then he nodded once, the way one soldier nods to another, and I understood that whatever passed between us in that small study was the truest commendation I would ever receive, worth more than any medal ever pinned on my tunic, and I have carried it in me ever since like a coal that will not go cold. The unwinding of it all took months, as these things do. The law moved with its glacial correctness, and Morwenna, for a time, did fight. Cassius's lawyers filed and blustered and threatened, as lawyers will when they are paid to, but every filing only dragged the jewels and the false insurance and the accounts into fuller light, and there is a point past which even a determined thief's own counsel begins to advise surrender, and that point was reached before the winter was out. The petition was granted. The marriage was dissolved. The properties Morwenna had raced to lock away, the sealed east wing rooms, the pasture where the gray mare Comet grazed, remained the crown's, because a small brave controller named Bellamy had bought the king 3 days by losing some ink, and 3 days had been enough. The jewels came home, every stone. The diamond collar, the emerald drops, the coronation ring, the sapphires from the old queen's collection, all of it recovered, appraised, and restored. The royal pieces to the collection, and Isolde's own bequest to the trust that would hold it for Princess Malin until she came of age. Morwenna left the House of Harrowgate on a clear, cold morning in the new year, with what the law allowed her and not one stone more. I was not on the door that day, by my own request. I judged that a guardsman who had served her the papers had no business also being the face she saw as she went, and Lord Osric agreed, and so it was other men who saw her to the car. But I watched, from a window in the upper gallery, and I will tell you the truth of it, because it is the only ending honest to what I saw. She did not go raging. She went the way people go when the story they told themselves about their own life has finally been taken from them, and they have not yet found another to put in its place, smaller than she had ever seemed, walking carefully across the cobbles in the cold, a handsome woman in an expensive coat who had gambled everything on a house that measured her against a ghost and lost. Cassius went with her, and Verona, their own smaller ruins to reckon with. And then the car was gone through the gates, and the long gray war of the House of Harrowgate was over, and the house exhaled. It is the small things I remember best from the season that followed, the way you always remember the small things after a great one. I remember Princess Malin being told, gently, by her grandfather himself, at a time of his own choosing, that a set of jewels her grandmother Isolde had loved would one day be hers, when she was grown, because her grandmother had wished it so, and because they had been kept safe for her. I was on the gallery that day, and I saw her come out of the king's study afterward, and she did not care 2 straws about the jewels, being 9. But she had been told, in the telling, that her grandmother Isolde had loved her and thought of her and set something aside for her before she died, and that she cared about, that lit her whole small face, and she walked down the gallery holding the king's old hand and asking him what her grandmother had been like. And the old man's face, as he told her, was a thing I will not try to describe because I have not the words for it. I remember, too, the watercolor of the horse. It was returned to the nursery corridor. I do not know by whose hand, but I have my suspicions, and they involve a private secretary who was thinner and quieter through that whole gray year, and who deserved more thanks than he ever got, and it hung there again, a small girl's careful painting of an old gray mare, pinned crooked at a child's height, in a corridor of a house where the greatest jewels of a kingdom had just been fought over and won back. And I thought, passing it on my rounds, this. This is what it was all for. Not the sapphires, not the diamonds. A child's picture of a horse back on its wall, and the child free to walk the corridor without a closed door sending her away with empty hands. And I remember the gray mare herself, Comet. That spring, when the weather turned, King Alaric took to walking out to the north pasture in the mild afternoons. His knees be damned, he said. A man could walk if he went slow, and he would stand at the fence and feed the old mare from his flat hand. The mare his Isolde had ridden the length of that park before her illness. The mare Morwenna had twice tried to gift away and been thwarted by an old groom's convenient forgetfulness. Sometimes Malin walked out with him. Sometimes little Bram, or grave young Torin. And once on my own off-duty afternoon, I saw the king out there alone, an old man at a fence feeding an old horse, the low spring sun on the both of them, and I did not intrude. But I stood a while at a distance and watched, and I thought that a kingdom's justice, when it is done right, does not always look like justice. Sometimes it looks like an old man and an old horse in the afternoon sun, at peace, on land that could not be stolen from either of them. I have stood a great many posts since that gray year. I stood them until my knees at last retired me altogether, and now I stand none. And I am old enough myself to walk slow to a fence in the afternoon sun. King Alaric is gone now. He lived some years yet, good years, and Crown Prince Rowan reigns in his place, well and wisely. And grave young Torin is grave young Torin no longer, but a fine tall man who will reign after him in his turn. And Malin came of age not long ago, and wore her grandmother Isolde's jewels for the first time at a great occasion, the diamond collar and the emerald drops, all of it, home where it belonged, on the throat of the girl it was always meant for. I was there. I was old and pensioned and stood at the back with the other old men, and I watched a grown young woman wear the jewels a scheming stranger had once tried to bleed away from her when she was 9, and I confess I was not entirely composed, and I did not care, because I was not on duty, and an old man is allowed his shine of the eye at such a moment. People ask me, when they learn what I did, for it is a story that got about, in the quiet way palace stories do, whether it was hard. Whether it was hard to stand there and serve a queen with the ruin of everything she had built. And they expect me to say yes, and to tell them of the pressure of it, the weight, the tension of that gray 10 o'clock room. But I tell them the truth, which is stranger and simpler than they expect. It was not hard. It was the easiest hard thing I have ever done, because I was not in that room doing a cruel thing dressed as a kind one, and I was not doing a kind thing that would turn cruel if I fumbled it. I was doing a correct thing, cleanly in the king's colors, for a child who could not do it for herself and an old man who could not bear to do it alone. And a correct thing done cleanly does not weigh on a man the way a shameful thing does. It settles into him. It becomes part of what he is. I served the Queen Consort of Harrowgate with divorce papers, on a gray morning by my own gloved hand, upon the order of my king. I laid them squared upon a table with the reverence one shows a coffin, and I did not raise my voice, and I did not lift a hand, and I did not give a scheming woman 1 inch of cruelty to stand upon, and because I did not, an old king's justice came down like justice, and not like vengeance. The jewels came home, and a small girl kept her grandmother's love and her painting of a horse. That is the whole of it. That is what a guardsman is for when it comes down to it, not to shout, not to strike, but to hold a line no one else can hold correctly until the right thing is done. I held mine. And of all the posts I ever stood in 22 years, in the bearskin and out of it, on the forecourt and in the galleries, that gray morning in the receiving room is the one I would stand again exactly as I stood it, without changing a single breath. The king reached his limit, they said. The Queen Consort was handed shocking papers. But I was the hand that handed them, and I can tell you it was not the king's anger that ended her. It was his dignity, carried correctly to her door.